Hello, class. We're going to have a talk through of this story rather than just a PowerPoint presentation. And I think this will allow me to give you a little bit more information than you won't just have to sit and read. The first thing I'd like to talk about is A Rose for Emily. I hope you maybe enjoyed is the wrong word, but I hope that this story was provocative and interesting to you. It's probably William Faulkner's most famous story. We're going to begin by talking about the social and historical context of this story. The historical context of A Rose for Emily is that the story is set in the years following the Civil War. This time is also sometimes referred to as the Reconstruction era. So, this is the time when the southern states were rebuilding and rethinking their way of life after the Civil War. Um, we refer to the time before the Civil War as the Old South. This was a time when the South was ruled by a wealthy class of white men who owned property. These men were kind of like an aristocracy, almost like what you'd have in Europe and England. They weren't necessarily called princes and dukes and things, but that was more or less their station. They were wealthy property owners. They didn't practice a profession. Ownership was how they made their money. And of course, that money was made on the backs of slave labor. After the Civil War, when slavery was at least officially brought to a close, you can imagine that for an economy that was built entirely on slave labor, if you just remove it and make it illegal, that economy falls to ruin. And so the people who were previously very wealthy noblemen are become no better than their neighbors. And in some cases, worse off than their neighbors because they were used to a way of life where they did not have to work. Um, and suddenly they're kind of thrust into the modern world. And that modern world we call the New South, which is a more egalitarian time and place. So everybody has to work for what they have, nobody owns or commands others. And Miss Emily's family, the Grierson family in this story, were members of that elite class in the Old South. So they thought quite a lot of themselves. They had lots of money. They owned a plantation. They were very wealthy. And their family goes through the Civil War and the collapse of the Southern economy. And their family, in many ways, falls to ruin. The world kind of continues and presses forward around them, but they're stuck in this way of thinking that, we're noble and we deserve the best, but they really are penniless at this point because the world has changed on them, and that will become important as we go forward. That brings us to the style of the story. The story is written in what's called a Southern Gothic style. You might have heard of the Gothic style, which is kind of scary, creepy, Edgar Allan Poe type writing. Southern Gothic is a particular offshoot of this type of writing. So, Southern Gothic style means that the story is typically going to be set on a decaying landscape or against a decaying setting. So, you can see that in A Rose for Emily, the house itself is falling apart, and the elements of decay are present all through the house. Miss Emily no longer has the resources to take care of it, so it's kind of falling apart in shambles around her. Southern Gothic stories will often have a dark or sinister theme. I probably don't need to explain to you what is dark and sinister about A Rose for Emily at this point. Um, Characters in Southern Gothic literature are often grotesque in nature, and this doesn't just mean what they look like, although Miss Emily is described in such a way that she might have been pretty when she was young, but she's described as really creepy looking when she gets older. She's kind of bloated and powdery pale with creepy black eyes. But it's also that their characters themselves are grotesque, so they might do things that are grotesque to us, or they might have some kind of demented personality, which all of those things apply to Miss Emily. And finally, in Southern Gothic literature, the plots will revolve around violence, yes, racism, yes, alienation, yes, and decay. So we have all of these things present in A Rose for Emily. Generally, the Southern Gothic style is common among stories that are set after the Civil War because, as we said, you had all these previously grand houses and grand families who, between the period before the war and after the war, kind of fall apart. And so Southern Gothic literature examines kind of the ghosts of those previously noble families. This story is written in a particular point of view. A lot of times when I ask students the point of view of A Rose for Emily, they say, what's the third person? But it's actually not. It's written in the first person. So if you look back at the very first sentence of the story, it says, when Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. So this story is written in the first person from the point of view of a townsperson, somebody who went to her funeral. In this case, the main character, or the narrator rather, is a minor character. So the main character of the story is Miss Emily, but Miss Emily is not the narrator. We only learn about Miss Emily through the point of view of this minor character, her neighbor. Why is this important? Why not tell the story from Miss Emily's perspective? Well, if we're in Miss Emily's head, for one thing, then we know how the story ends already because we know everything she knows, right? We would know what she had done and what she planned to do. But because we are given the story from the point of view of a neighbor, we only see what the neighbors see. We only see the outside of the house. We only see Miss Emily when she comes outside into public life or when public figures are allowed in. And this preserves that kind of distance that the story emphasizes. Miss Emily was very isolated, so in that way we don't get to see what goes on behind closed doors. And of course, Miss Emily believed herself in many ways to be better than the average Joe citizen, her neighbors and townspeople. And so it makes sense that they would not have had a lot of interactions with each other. She would have stayed very private and very separate from them. And so the point of view in this case, having the story told from the point of view of a townsperson, seems appropriate because we only see about Emily what they see, what they're allowed to see. Here's kind of an overall take on this story. So what does all this mean? Is it just a scary story? Well, no, this story is about the inability of people to move on, mainly. So the setting of the story, of course, is right after the Civil War, and you can see Miss Emily's unwillingness to move on from the Old South way of doing things. She refuses to pay her taxes because she didn't have to in the Old South. She refuses to let go of people who have died. She refuses to put a mailbox on her house. She refuses to move from her house. So all of these things talk about the inability of people to move on. Now, we have this story about just one woman's inability to move on, but her struggle to move on symbolizes in many ways the struggle of all of the ruling class of the Old South to move on. And still, probably, you know people who have not moved on from the Old South ways that involve racism and classicism. Many people struggle to move past those things and to let go of the past. And so this is a story very much about how the entire South kind of refused to change, even after it seemed like the war would force them to. Secondly, a second theme of the story is that the suppression of desires leads to ruin. So if we practice psychoanalytic criticism, as Freud would have us do, we can look at Miss Emily and her relationship with her father. And if you read back through the story, you'll notice that when Miss Emily was young and beautiful, she had many suitors come to her house to call on her. And her father always turned them away. He believed that nobody was good enough for his daughter, which of course echoes that Old South way of thinking. My daughter is an aristocrat. My daughter is a fine lady. When in fact they were penniless. But because her father keeps her shut up in the house and does not allow her to have suitors, she has to suppress those desires. She suppresses the desires for many years forcibly to have a companion, to have a lover, a husband. And because of those things, of course, that leads to her acting out in this murderous way. So a psychoanalytic reading of this text would tell us that one of the reasons that Miss Emily ultimately snaps is because she has been prevented from fulfilling and acting on her most natural desires. I pointed out a few important symbols for you all. These are not the only symbols in the story, but these are the ones that relate to the themes that are here above. First of all, the house is extremely symbolic. I've already mentioned how the house itself relates to those Old South plantation houses that very often the families then could not afford to keep up after slavery was ended, so the houses would fall into ruin. So I want you to notice how the house is described. It was a big squarish frame house that had once been white, decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the heavy, lightsome style of the 70s, set on what had once been our most select street. But garages and cotton gins had encroached and obliterated even the august names of that neighborhood. Only Miss Emily's house was left, lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and the gasoline pumps, an eyesore among eyesores. So notice that Miss Emily's house, everybody else has moved off of this street. This used to be a nice street, right, in the Old South. And in the New South, it's become kind of a industrial type street where businesses do their business and operate. And Miss Emily's house is described as being stubborn, right? Just as Miss Emily is stubborn and refuses to move on, her house is described as being stubborn, right? It will not move, and it shows its decay, an eyesore among eyesores. So the house itself is very symbolic of Miss Emily's inability to change or move on, even as the world is changing around her. I mentioned the taxes and mail, so Miss Emily refuses to pay new taxes after Colonel Sartoris passes away. And she also refuses to have a mailbox put on her house when the town gets used to the postal service. Again, these represent her inability to move on. And the final way that her inability to move on is symbolized is through her refusal to acknowledge death, which is one of the biggest changes that anybody has to cope with. The first death that she refuses to acknowledge is Colonel Sartoris, who, of course, agrees that Miss Emily does not have to pay taxes because she's a noblewoman, but when he dies, they come for her taxes, and she says, no, ask Colonel Sartoris, I don't have to pay taxes. But by this time, he's been dead 10 years, so she refuses to acknowledge his death. When her father dies, and people come to her house to help her with that, she at first refuses to acknowledge that he's dead and doesn't let anybody touch or carry his body out for several days. And then, of course, we have Homer Barron, who Miss Emily not only refuses to acknowledge his death, but refuses to acknowledge his abandonment of her, and so she dresses him in wedding clothes and carries on a kind of eternal game of pretend until she passes away. So I hope that these things illuminate your reading of the story, and there's certainly more that you can glean from the story than just these things, but if you're looking for a kind of central theme, I think these are the main ones. I welcome your emails and messages if you have any further questions about A Rose for Emily.